Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. As Canada prepares to observe the fourth annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we're checking in with Indigenous nonprofit leaders from across the country about what, if any, progress has been made when it comes to how the wider nonprofit sector supports, funds, and collaborates with Indigenous-led organizations. Are legislative changes to how charities can work with non-qualified donees making a difference? Are Canadian charities and foundations doing a better job of ensuring more funding dollars go to Indigenous-led groups? To discuss these important issues, I'm joined by Nation Cheong, Vice President of Community Impact and Mobilization for United Way, Greater Toronto Area. Um, with 25 years' experience in community development, dedicating his professional career and personal efforts to fostering caring, safe, and culturally vibrant communities, formerly in his role as Vice President of Community Opportunities and Mobilization, Nation was instrumental in developing United Way's Reconciliation and Equity Action Plan and the Indigenous Partnership Council, demonstrating his commitment to reconciliation and equitable community impact. Today, in his present role, Nation leads a dynamic team that drives United Way's community service investments and systems solutions. Welcome to the podcast, Nation.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
I wonder if we could start by if you could give us a little bit of background on your efforts to better work with Indigenous communities and the Indigenous-led organizations and how that led to the creation of the Indigenous Partnership Council.
I'll take you back to 2017. At the time, we were taking a intentional effort to drive diversity and inclusion across the community service sector and all of the funded partners that we work with. And at that point, a number of Indigenous leaders, leaders of Indigenous-led community services, as a matter of fact, said to us, pause, we are not part of the diversity and inclusion conversation. The relationship with Indigenous communities centers on treaties, centers on land rights, it centers on self-determination. And so if you want to have that discussion with us, we need to have a separate conversation that is not under the auspice of diversity and inclusion, but under the auspice of truth and reconciliation. That led to United Way hiring our first senior manager of Indigenous collaboration, wonderful colleague from formerly from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, who came on board to help us accomplish two primary objectives. One was to deepen our relationship with Indigenous leaders in the GTA, and the second, begin to map out what our key priorities are outside of relationship building, to begin to think about how we invest differently, how we do research, public policy differently. And after 2 years of that work, it resulted in a broad framework. Our Indigenous collaboration framework kind of sat on a spreadsheet. And then COVID hit. Our colleague was called to a different line of work, and we hired another senior manager for Indigenous collaboration. However, at that time, because of the needs of the pandemic made clear across communities, we had to park all of the strategic priorities and just focus on immediate needs. So just getting money into the hands of community services. And like many other community organizations, it was exhausting work. It took its toll. And so we took pause at that time. And at that juncture, some of the senior leaders of Indigenous-led community services approached United Way, engaged our CEO, and said, let's start over. It's great that you have staff, but we need something broader, and we need a deeper relationship with United Way that isn't just about allocating dollars to community services, but thinking through together, hand in hand, what the big picture is for a growing population of urban Indigenous folks who span First Nation, Métis, Inuit, etc. And that led to September 21st gathering at Evergreen Brickworks, where approximately 8 leaders of Indigenous community services came together representing Toronto, Peel, and York region facilitated by John Bocage, former Ontario Chief of the Anishinaabe, a great leader who pulled together and helped us to build the right relationship. And on that day of September 21st, everything shifted. A different tone was set. We ensured that our CEO, Danielle Izanari, was there. We also ensured our board of directors, our board chair was there, Pato Campo, Dr. Pato Campo, as a matter of fact. And that was important because it signaled to the community that this commitment to work differently, to step into our responsibilities as a philanthropic organization to address truth and reconciliation was all the way through the organization. This wasn't just a senior manager showing up. This was the CEO, this was the board chair, and senior staff showing up for this important conversation. And the first conversation was about truth telling. The first conversation was an acknowledgement of the great work that United Way had done to date, but also to put on the table things that did not meet the community's expectations and to have that open dialogue. The first remark as we went around the circle and everyone introduced them set the tone. And it was a leader in a very emotional opening who said, whatever we do from this point forward, whatever we say from this point forward, has to lead to self-determination. If it does not lead to self-determination, we're heading down the wrong path. And I thought that was critical because it's set the tone, the frame, and the table stakes for all of the work that has followed since. As we stepped back from that meeting and looked at the feedback and thought about what the next steps for that work started to result in the development of the Indigenous Partnership Council. And so we started to draft the terms of reference because it was clear from the feedback we heard that this has to be more than just conversations. People wanted to see something substantive. People wanted to see something that was endorsed by the board of directors and senior staff to demonstrate that it wasn't just conversational, although that is the heart of relationship building, but that it had teeth and that it was a commitment that United Way was stepping into. And so the staff were tasked to build that terms of reference and to vet it with the members of the forming Indigenous Partnership Council. And in addition to that, begin to identify who was missing from the table. We honed in on 3 key areas for the partnership through the Indigenous Partnership Council: community investment, fundraising, and research and public policy. That those were the 3 broad areas with which we would look to manifest our work and identify shared objectives and identify ways in which we can pull resources together to drive impact or drive change in those 3 areas. Go ahead, please.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you
That's
finished
okay.
your thought.
Yeah, the first conversations I've started to focus on what are the key priorities in the community. And so we had our health counts, which was published in the last couple of years, that identify the health needs of a growing urban Indigenous population. We had other historical documents that we could refer to, but the conversation quickly honed in on mental health and substance dependency as critical issues that are eroding the cultural, familial community fabric that is critical for rebuilding Indigenous communities. And that became the focal point very, very quickly. The question was, what are we going to do about it? Is it about funding existing programs? And the conversation could have quickly turned in that direction. And so it was important for us to remind folks, we have investment in community programs right now. What can we do with this $1.5 million that is at a systems level that would change the infrastructure and improve the infrastructure for Indigenous-led community services? And the group honed in on building a healing lodge, an Indigenous-led healing lodge that would bridge clinical services with cultural healing practices and cultural restoration for Indigenous folks across Peel, York, and Toronto. So now we have a vision, we have an objective, we've got $1.5 million, that's not going to build a building. And our task was now to do a jurisdictional scan. Where would this building be located? Who are the partners? What are the government resources? Who are the local leaders who need to be engaged in this conversation? And to identify what this space should look like. Uh, and that's everything from meeting the needs of women to people from the two-spirited community. So all of that work is underway. In the meantime, we have been building relationships with Ontario Health, as this is also in their jurisdiction. And when we met with them to just let them know the work that was unfolding, they were very excited and they asked to be kept on board to see where there are opportunities for us to meet mutual objectives and bridge the world of philanthropy with public dollars. Because I think the needs are such that we recognize philanthropy is not going to solve this all on our own. We need to partner with private public sector partners to deliver something as significant as an Indigenous-led healing lodge or healing space. So I'll pause there. That's a quick snapshot of the work from 2017 to where we are now.
Well, I must say it's quite an inspiring story, and one that I'd be very interested in following the status and the progress of this healing lodge. It sounds like a marvelous idea and a great sort of result of collaboration and really listening to the needs of people in the Indigenous communities, but what they feel they need. I guess in practical terms, how does United Way of Greater Toronto work with the Indigenous Partnership Council differently? How has the Partnership Council, the creation of it, and I guess even the collaborative kind of spirit that was brought to the early discussions that formed the basis of it, how has it changed the way your organization works?
The simplest way to describe that is to say that when we sat with the council, because of historical relationships and because United Way holds the purse string and is often the power broker in the space, intentional or otherwise, it kind of default to a particular dynamic. And so we had to be explicit and intentional that we wanted to change that dynamic. And it took 2 or 3 meetings to say to the folks at the table, this is your table. This is not our table. You are leading. We are seeking direction from you. And I think that was necessary to repeat, to shift the mindset in practice, and also to demonstrate that that is how we're showing up. We're showing up with this openness to say, we've got this, we've agreed on this terms of reference. It took about 3 or 4 meetings to get that right. And one of the most affirming comments that we heard from an elder in the group was, you're listening. I can see clearly that you're listening to us because our words are in those terms of reference. And you have taken time to vet and ensure that our values are embedded in these terms of reference. The reference to the medicine wheel is an example of how we try to overlay the values of the medicine wheel with those terms of reference. As much as I think we got 95% of it right, the tweaking of language to be very, very explicit that it is by and for Indigenous peoples was made really clear. And so we said, okay, I thought we had that right. We're going to go back and we're going to do it again, and then we'll make sure it's to your satisfaction. Those actions and not moving at the pace of trust versus moving at an agenda that I need to get these deliverables done by such and such a date is the difference maker. And being open to hearing, not sure the comma's in the right place. That may seem like something small and minuscule, but the fact that you'll pause and say, let's have a conversation. What was the intention? Are we on the same page? Do you still feel like that needs to be corrected? I choose something as simple as a comma. I mean, it's not exclusive to Indigenous communities. It could be with the government who will debate over a comma. But moving at the pace of trust is the critical difference. And sometimes that means putting aside our timelines for a little bit and just saying, as long as we're not compromising this delicate fabric of trust that we need to rebuild and hold on to, we're in the right place. And to hear from an elder, you're listening. We feel like you're really listening to us. I think it lifted our sails after 4 or 5 meetings, that because you're so always so anxious, like, oh, are we getting it right? Are we saying the right things? Are we saying the wrong things? I'm not sure, like, I'm not getting the feedback that I expected. That moment in that meeting was just, I think everyone's shoulders came down, like, okay, good. Stay right here. Don't move too fast. So I would say that that's what shaped the difference with the Indigenous Partnership Council, and signaled to the community that had a historical dynamic that United Way is showing up differently, and it's not just pushing through just to get it done.
Well, I'd like for you to have an opportunity to talk about what the outcomes have been so far. And I don't mean just I guess, the concrete outcomes, but also, I guess, the outcomes that you're talking about now, like the processes, the quality of your relationship, that outcome as well. What do you think has been achieved so far?
Trust, yeah, fundamental. I think it's the thing that in all of our work, whether with Indigenous communities or otherwise, I think trust is underestimated. How significant that resource is to getting good work done. I think we can easily focus on the funding, the strategic plan, the logic model. Do we have leadership at the table to make decisions? All those things are important. Underneath it is trust. And I think that this relationship that we have been honored to rebuild with Indigenous leaders is a good reminder to, and a regrounding in that very fundamental principle, but also refreshing reminder that when it's done right, things move in a wonderful way. And you see more participation, you see more response, you see more willingness to engage further. It's less of a struggle to get people to the table for discussion. I think, in addition to trust, which can appear or sound ethereal, translate that into documents like a terms of reference is critical. That's an output as opposed to an outcome, but it is a demonstration that this is a document endorsed by the board and senior leadership. And so there's it adds value, it underpins that trust that you're building that can often feel ethereal. In addition to that, the relationship between the Indigenous Partnership Council and our board of directors has been another link to solidifying the relationship and encouraging folks to continue forward in collaboration. And what that looks like is the elder from the Indigenous Partnership Council comes to the annual board meeting in December and provides an update and feedback on the work and takes questions from the board and indicates the work is going well. We're feeling good about the work, or I think we still have some challenges in areas A, B, and C. So far, it's been good. Uh, so all of those are uh, the early outcomes of the work, some outputs. In terms of the tangible investment pieces, well, as I said, $1.5 million has been earmarked and reserved for that work. An interesting piece for us is, within our organization, people who do like the finance, the back office stuff, and the tech people are like, wow, we don't. You're the front facing, community facing folks. We don't have anything to do with equity and reconciliation. That's all the out stuff. And this is demonstrated. No, you actually have a role. How do we use our financial systems to ensure that those dollars are reserved for that sole purpose? So that's been a wonderful reward to see our colleagues see themselves in this work and not just see that it's the outward facing functions of the organization. Uh, Expanding our relationships with Ontario Health, that is another amazing output. And that's important to United Way, again, because we recognize that the type of impact we want to have in community goes beyond programmatic participation. That's important. I'm not diminishing that. But if, as a organization that takes a stance to address poverty. We have to address it at a systems level. We have to understand the systems that act as barriers for to change, that perpetuate these conditions and address those systems. And so that automatically means we have to go beyond the world of community services. We have to think about, understand what are the strategies and resources that the public sector, our municipal partners, our provincial partners, and to a certain degree our federal partners have. How do we leverage those opportunities to meet mutual goals, always with community at the center, always with the Indigenous community saying, yes, that is the direction, go. Private sector. And so in the last 4 years, certainly as the Canadian consciousness has expanded to understand the true history of Canada's relations with Canada's First People and the history of residential schools. I think the shocking awakening to unmarked graves has really opened up people's minds and opened up their hearts. And I would say in the private sector, corporate sector, we are seeing that as well. And so our corporate partners are saying, you're our philanthropic partner, you are a community impact partner. What are you doing when it comes to reconciliation? And so this is another opportunity to say, we're being led by community. There are some very clear, tangible goals. How do we work with you and your philanthropic aspirations, your corporate social responsibility aspirations to align and drive that work? And I think what it does is it affirms United Way's historical role as not just a convener, but a mobilizer. I think that convener identity is really translating in these last few years into a mobilizer. Mobilizer in common vision for action, not just sitting at the table and talking, which is what the Indigenous community has said to us. No more talk. We have to go beyond the important but limited land acknowledgement exercises and then get into how are we really changing the systems that have perpetuated and upheld the inequalities and the oppression that the community has felt. And we have a responsibility to that as an organization that stakes a claim to address poverty.
Well, that's so encouraging to hear of this journey that you're on, and how it's allowed your entire um, your entire team to be able to go on this journey forward in partnership with the Indigenous leaders. Were there any particular challenges that you faced through the process of setting up and working with the council, and how did you work through those challenges?
One of my early experiences going back to 2017 when we hired our first senior manager of Indigenous collaboration, we wanted to get everything so right. And so, what are the Indigenous protocols? When do you give tobacco? When do you not give tobacco? How do you greet properly? Everything, because everybody just wants to get it right. And one of the things that I experienced that was eye opening for me is in meeting an individual from the community. I offered tobacco. The purpose of offering tobacco is to signal through respect uh, an invitation to do something together, an invitation to do work together. So this is kind of like a contract and honoring us in that regard. And the individual received the tobacco and said thank you, and they said, and I'm going to give it right back to you now, because one of the things I'm going to leave you with is we are not all the same. We are not a monolithic group. We have different practices, different beliefs. And that individual said to me, I am Christian. I am not traditional. I I'm not taking away from, I understand the importance of tradition, but I'm a Christian and I don't accept tobacco. Significant moment. It was pivotal. And so one of the challenges for many groups working with Indigenous communities is to fall into the trap of a monolithic group. Indigenous communities are not Inuit, Métis, First Nations, Anishinaabe, First, Haudenosaunee. Yes, same family group, but very different practices, significantly different practices that they take pride in. And honoring that in building a diverse Indigenous Partnership Council requires sensitivity and, again, taking your time and recognizing that this sits well with everybody. Another challenge is folks who are coming from institutions. So we had institutional folks who were in existing institutions that were non-Indigenous, and we spent a lot of time saying for folks saying, "Am I here as an Indigenous person, or am I here as an Indigenous person representing the school board or the university? Which is it? Because if I'm here as an Indigenous person, then I can speak freely in these ways. If you're receiving me as representing university or whatever institution, I am limited by the parameters of that organization, and I'm I will be limited to what I say and I can offer. So understanding that people navigate multiple identities when you're trying to form this type of table of experts who you will rely on to guide your work and to validate that you are stepping in the right direction. There's a tension there. You want to leverage the vision, the strategic priorities of institutions. You necessarily should be engaging with people who are of Indigenous heritage driving that work. But there's a tension point between what an individual feels is possible and can be done through their lens as an Indigenous person versus what the institution can and is willing to do. So always being able to respect that and hear both sides. So an individual might say, I think the right choice is to do A, B, and C. However, I know my organization will do 8.1 and that's it. That's where they're at right now. Recognizing that, affirming that, and allowing someone to be all of those things in the space is critically important to doing this work really well. In the last piece, I would say is that Indigenous leaders in the last 4 or 5 years are being pulled in multiple directions. Everybody wants an Indigenous advisory table. Everybody wants to know that they're doing their work well. And there are just very few people to pull on. And so we've started to see where folks are like, I can't show up at yet another table. And so I think as we commit collectively as a sector to invest in a next generation of leaders to pick up the work, we have to recognize that those who are leading at this point are being pulled in multiple directions. And the encouragement that I offer is leverage existing tables to the degree that there's openness for you to join an advisory, and if you have a mutual agenda, a mutual vision, find other ways to engage that is less demanding on Indigenous leaders. Folks want to lend their voice. They want to ensure folks are doing it right. It's always important to demonstrate that you've done your homework. Like asking questions that have been answered 20 times and you can go on YouTube and get the answer is usually received as a disingenuous effort, because it appears as you're not lifting what you can lift, and then showing up to say what more should I learn, what more should I understand. So I think doing that heavy lifting and doing that fundamental work and showing that you've done your best to understand and continue to be open to learning is essential to that trust building and mobilizing other people's efforts, because they're going to see that you're willing to do the work and you're not going to dump it, like continue to push it on. Oh, can you do this? Can you fill out this form? Can you answer these questions? Like, no, there is no shortage of information. Go and learn that information and show up that's the starting point. And then we can build from there, is the message that I think many Indigenous communities would share with folks who are trying to build good relations and do their part for truth and reconciliation.
Sounds like a very humbling and yet insightful and inspiring experience that you've gone through. What advice, as we wrap up, what advice would you give to other settler led organizations who would like to create better partnerships with Indigenous led organizations and communities?
Start with truth telling. Start with an openness to hear the other's experience. Um, I think it is important to demonstrate commitment beyond a frontline staff who has limited decision making power. People will not put their time and energy into that. I know I've heard that clearly. I've heard this from the IPC when recommending building relationships with government. And I've heard very, very frankly, if this is where they direct you, don't bother. Nothing gets done there. You need the decision maker at the table. And so if organizations, not for profit, communities, human service organizations, uh, are genuinely interested in identifying what they can do as an organization to uh, advance truth and reconciliation, having that board senior leadership commitment at the table, not every, doesn't have to be every meeting, but at those key junctures, I think is a critical formula for success. I think people feel confident when they see decision makers at the table. And people get worn out when someone has to go back to three, four people to get an answer. People just, they're exhausted, they're done. It's, and being pulled in multiple directions, they're going to make strategic choices about where's stuff actually happening, as opposed to I keep showing up here and I keep saying the same thing over 5 meetings and nothing moves because this person can't make a decision. I think that's critical to success. I would recommend putting decision makers at the table and ensuring, even if those decision makers can't be there for every meeting, that there is a organizational commitment and you can see it in the budget. My last comment is the strategy is good, the plans are good, the vision and the objectives and the relationship is essential. But if you haven't put it in your budget, you're not serious. It has to be in your budget because this work costs money. You need the right staff persons. And then when the work starts to take foot and get some ground, you need the resources to support it. Otherwise, you'll lose trust, you'll lose faith, and you'll lose people at the table.
Well, Nation, we are so grateful for your insights and your wise counsel to nonprofits and charities in Canada as they navigate their reconciliation journeys and seek better ways to support Indigenous led organizations and communities. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to seeing the work unfold throughout the sector.